Hello and welcome to the first County Board wrap-up of 2019. I'm your host, Kara O'Donnell, and each month we sit down with the Arlington County Board Chair and another member of the board to take a look at the decisions it made that affect you, your neighborhood, and our community. This month we're joined by Christian Dorsey, our newly elected chair for 2019, as well as newly elected Vice Chair Libby Garvey. Christian, Libby, thank you both for being here today. And we're going to begin today by talking a little bit about some of the priorities that the board has for 2019. So let's get right to it. Christian, some of your big priorities for this year as chair.
Well, Kara, our biggest priority, at least the one that will be before us soon enough, will be consideration of the FY 2020 budget, And, by state law, we have to have a balanced budget. Right. But the key question is how we're going to balance it. And for me, it's going to be a huge priority to make sure we don't deal with our budget gap in a way that makes Arlington not look like the Arlington that everybody knows and loves. So it's essential that we continue to provide the programs and the services that people not only rely on, but that give our community the wonderful reputation that it has for delivering good services. But at the same time, we have to be really thoughtful, strong about getting rid of things that don't work for us anymore or that should be restructured in a way that they're more cost efficient. So I predict that we'll have to spend a lot of time really working through this budget to make sure our decisions deliver good programs and services, but set us on the course for good fiscal sustainability. So that's not easy, but it's going to be important that we get it right. Mm-hmm.
Because this is going to be kind of a belt-tightening type of budget for us.
That's right.
What has kind of led to the county's situation that it's in right now, where we are in this belt-tightening time? A lot of people say things like, well, this is such an affluent community,
right.
That kind of thing. How could we be in a lean year?
Well, we are an affluent community. We are a well-positioned community generally, but we're not immune to forces, particularly some big ones that we've experienced over the last decade. We've had 25,000 federal jobs that have left the Crystal City area. That would devastate most communities. Ours has largely been resilient, but it does mean that we have significant a lack of strength in the commercial sector, which affects residential taxpayers because the brunt of paying for government falls on them. So it means that if we're going to keep their taxes relatively stable, we have to reduce the amount of services that we provide. We have to defer some things, and it leaves us ultimately with budget gaps that we have to solve. And at the same time, even though we've had a lot of federal jobs leaving, we've got lots of people coming in. People who want to be here for good schools, and so we're dealing with rising costs and school enrollment. So when you put that together, it leaves us where we are. Again, we're going to solve it. We're going to be up to the task of making sure it works, but it's going to require that Libby and my colleagues, we work together very constructively.
And I'll just put in too, the bigger picture, which I'm realizing more and more, is the effect of over the last 20 to 30 years of the federal government backing out of the safety net. So affordable housing, for example, federal support for affordable housing has gone down by, I think it's like 75%. So we have to fill that in because we care about the people that are here.
Absolutely.
We have a diverse community, and I've just sort of watching what's happening more and more. It feels like the support that used to come in from the state and from the federal government has been shrinking, and the demands on us have been increasing, and it gets harder and harder. It just creates more and more strain to continue to provide the kind of services and make this the kind of community that we all want to live in. And I hope that trend will eventually start to change a little bit, and that both the state and the federal government will start to step up a little bit to their responsibilities, because it's making it harder and harder for us to deliver what we need to do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Christian, how about some of your own initiatives that you would like to see Arlington come to pass throughout this year as chair?
Well, something that I highlighted on January 1st was a commitment to having a professional focus on equity. And by that, I mean making sure that we recognize that there are disparities that exist in our community, and those disparities matter, and that government has a role in not only addressing those inequities, but also ensuring that our actions don't create new or deepen existing inequities. And there's a lot of work that comes from that, but really it's informed by the whole idea that we have to make sure that our decisions, whether they be investments, spending in the regular budget, or any of the other policy actions that are before the board, have at the outset this idea of equity. And let me give you a concrete example. A few years ago, when the Department of Human Services relocated from Wilson Boulevard down to the Sequoia Plaza, there were a lot of people who live in communities that were clients of DHS that had an easy one-seat bus ride access to Wilson Boulevard. Very convenient, very affordable. When it moved, those folks lost that one-seat ride and had to either do multiple buses or multimodal bus and walk, and that's often difficult when you are disabled or you have children.
Or the weather like we're having today.
Or weather like, weather
Right.
indeed.
There's that.
So, they were left with cobbling together all sorts of solutions, paying for taxis, doing things that actually made their limited dollars, not be devoted to good purposes. So we eventually, after hearing all of that, instituted a bus ride, which has proved to be, by the way, quite efficient and successful and great in order to provide that one-seat service. But it would have been better if we had done that at the outset, by thinking about the decision to move and who would be affected and how we might actually make government work for them. So that's really sort of an anecdote of what I'd like to see us do better at preventing in the first place. Arlington's great. When we see an inequity, we can address it. But even better is when you can prevent them from happening
Never
in the
having
first
them in the
place.
first
Right,
place.
right.
Exactly.
And seeing the inequity is really crucial. And you and I have been together with our colleagues and our colleagues on the school board and doing some discussions and looking at history and how actually government promoted inequity in the past. And we just all lived with that, grew up with it. You don't even see it until people start showing it to you. And that's part of the important discussion we're having, I think.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Okay. And I know another priority that you mentioned in your New Year's Day or day after New Year's,
Day after New Year's.
getting technical, is, you touched on this briefly, is restoring that commercial sector to its own, to good health. What are some of the avenues we're going to look at for that?
Well, I think probably the biggest one might be this large company that's planning an investment in Arlington. So that has become something that, beyond what Amazon is, I really think about what Amazon represents, and that is a planned investment to backfill those jobs that we lost, which ensures that the investments that we made in the Pentagon City and Crystal City corridor can actually be fully utilized. We've got Metro, well under capacity there. We've got the density plan for that area, so we can absorb it. And by absorbing it, it means that we have the commercial sector paying a lot more of the share of the tax responsibility for our community, which shifts some of the pressure off of the residential sector. And it means that we can continue to grow and invest to deal with new children in schools and all of the other ways in which our community is thriving. And it also, quite frankly, means that the sector plan that we have for Crystal City can actually be realized. What residents work so long and hard at mapping out what the vision for that area should be, without the commercial sector thriving, it wasn't going to happen.
No,
so
no.
now it can.
And actually, to emphasize the point that you actually made earlier was, those 25,000 federal jobs that left, most of those were in Crystal City.
Yeah.
So when Amazon moves in, they're just going to get us back to where we were about 10 years ago. And people don't always see that.
Right.
And so that's why we've got plenty of transportation, we got infrastructure, because we had it filled before.
That's right.
Yeah.
That actually is a nice segue to, Libby, some of the things you've been looking forward to this year, where you've been discussing a lot of the change that's coming and managing that change for our community.
Yeah, and I haven't got any sort of answers. I think it's just we need to be a little more intentional about thinking about the future and where it is we want to go. We get so wrapped up. So, for example, to talk about Amazon, and rightly so, concerned about the immediate effects. But let's think about where it's going to take us in 10, 20 years and make sure that we know where we want to go. Because if you don't know where you want to go, you're not likely to get there, right? And I think that's one thing that we do a lot of planning. We're actually known for the planning and how good our planning is. But what we haven't done so much is bringing all of that together in kind of one overall kind of vision. We've done that, I think, about 20 years ago now. We did a sort of look of looking forward to well, we're past that date now that we'd looked forward to. So it's time to kind of redo that. So, I just talked a bit about how, the strains of change are showing in our community, and it's much easier to handle change if you know what you're changing to. But if it's kind of a big, dark, amorphous, you're not sure what it is, it's hard to let go of what you know to go to something you don't see at all. So
just kind of opening eyes to and planning responsibly through that process.
Yes, and including the whole community, because then they feel like the community feels like it has some control over it. I think one of the things that I hear, when you listen to people talking about Amazon and concern, some of the subtext that I hear is concern and sort of fear about how big they are and how much they're going to change and control us. And I don't think that's going to be the case, but I think more we are intentional and explicit about what we're planning on and where we're going to go, the more comfortable people will be with the kind of changes we're going to see. The one thing we can't do is stay the same. And that's kind of hard for folks sometimes to really digest, but it's true. That's the one thing you can't do is just stay the way we've been.
And I will say that, there's one of the things that I think people in our community look to us to do is to, stop change for fear that it's going to degrade, as you mentioned. We have to, be very clear and honest that we can't stop change. However, we can find circumstances to manage it. And when you have a planned investment over a decade, to me, that is the level of comfort that I have that we'll be able to guide change in a way that's in people's best interest, as opposed to just, being reactive to whatever the market whims may be.
And reminding them about the sector plan that you mentioned. And we have been planning.
We've been planning
We
this.
have been. So, everybody kind of needs to take a deep breath and let's look at things. And they will look pretty good when you actually take the time to take a look at it.
And something you mentioned in the last couple of weeks that really struck me is an importance on keeping that dialogue open and keeping that dialogue not only on Amazon, but on all the issues that address our community, keeping that dialogue productive.
Right.
You just kind of
So I talked a little bit about civility, and I realize you have to be careful about that, because I'm not trying to say I'm the model of civility. I've been known to lose my temper on occasion, but I have seen really a degradation of the public dialogue, certainly nationwide, certainly across the river, but even here. And I think we need to, again, get more intentional about it and come back, right, we can disagree, but that doesn't mean we have to be, as they say, disagreeable. And we can be civil about it, and let's talk about the issues. I find people are all too quick to sometimes make huge assumptions about the intention of the other. You did this and this because you really wanted to do that and that. Where actually sometimes people make reasonable mistakes. Sometimes they're actually doing exactly what they should if you really looked at it. But as soon as you start making sort of personal attacks on people's intentions or what they're really trying to do, the whole conversation degrades and gets away from what we need to be looking at.
Okay.
Until you have proof otherwise, let's assume that everyone has good, decent intentions.
Exactly.
And I think if we followed that motto, we would be in a good place.
I think we would, and that's a good start.
All right. Well, on that note, we're going to take a short break, and when we return, we'll talk about the board's decision to lift residential parking restrictions in the Arlington Mill Forest Glen neighborhood. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm here with County Board Chair Christian Dorsey and Vice Chair Libby Garvey, who are explaining some of the key decisions the board took at its first meeting of 2019. Now, at this meeting, the board took a rather, let's call it unusual action in that you voted on a resolution your own motion to lift some parking restrictions. Explain this one a little bit to me.
So we have a residential parking permit program in Arlington, and that's something that the board actually doesn't govern. We delegate that to the county manager. And so that program has 24 zones throughout Arlington where there are various restrictions on who can park and when they can park, mostly to preserve the ability for people who live in Arlington to not have spaces eaten up from people who are commuting from outside of Arlington or visiting from other places. So we want to make sure that you can have access to your home to park. So we've got 24 such zones in the county, and one of them, and actually the most recent one, the circumstances were that people who lived within the neighborhood had an awfully difficult time finding parking, yet in the restricted areas there was an abundant supply of parking. So the program wasn't working to meet its design purposes. And then on top of that, we found out in the middle of sort of unpacking this issue that the process for designating the parking zone didn't follow the county manager's designated policies. And so for the board, we looked at both situations. You've got a situation where parking, the program is not working as intended, and we can't see that it followed the administrative practices, so we, on our own motion, decided that we were going to eliminate them.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we're in the middle of a study. That was sort of part of the thing that got mixed. In fact, that's how I think the problems with how this particular zone was decided were discovered, when they started really looking at what was going on. And the study, I think we have another, is it 6 months to a year before they come back with some. And meanwhile, as you know, as Christian mentioned, we had people who, I mean, they were giving us stories. If they weren't home by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they were walking like a mile or 2 miles to try to get home. And again, when the weather is bad and late at night. Whereas the other neighborhood right there next door, I mean, they really are all kind of in the same neighborhood. Every home had a driveway and a garage, so pretty much the streets were empty. So, you know, in a way, this was a frustrating thing to me, and it took us a while to kind of come back and change it and realize what all was going on. But our putting in that program made life kind of miserable for some people, really worse. And that bothered. I mean, the role of government is to make life better, you know, get the situation set so people can have a good life. And when we make things worse for people, it kind of drives me crazy. So that was part of the reason that we did this unusual step, because we just felt like we really needed to do that.
So the study that's going on now, is this on all of the residential parking
Yes, the whole
areas?
program, yes.
And where does that stand right now? Are we just looking at what's working, what's not? Is there anything we need to change countywide?
And what's the purpose of the program? And is it
that's right.
meeting its intent? Because it came in, I think it was the 70s, wasn't it?
Well, the program's been
in
around
place for a
since
long
the
time.
Supreme Court cases in the 70s. Actually, the Supreme Court case was based on Arlington, that established the ability to restrict parking to prevent commuters from taking up spots that should be enjoyed by people who are part of a locality. But our program hasn't been reviewed since 2005. And so, you know, we're Arlington.
Community has changed
So we
quite a
want to
bit
make
since
sure
then.
we're reviewing things in a timely fashion. And, you know, this was a particularly difficult case, but it certainly merits looking at the entire program to see what we could do administratively better, whether there are new ways of designating these, whether or not the fees are appropriate. You know, we need to look at it really from the ground up. But as Libby said, this particular restricted area provided such an imbalance of program goals and objectives that we felt continuing it would do a disservice to not only the affected residents, but to the entire integrity of the program.
Another project that I feel like we've been talking about forever, and that's Fire Station 8.
Just a few years,
But
that's
it
all.
is now moving forward.
Yeah.
What was the vote this month?
So this was a modest step forward in the process of making sure that there is design and construction money to go ahead and take all of the information that we've gathered at this point and begin sketching out what the new Fire Station 8 is going to look like. We know that it's going to be 2 stories, about 15,000 square feet, and we've appropriated the funds to ensure that that critical design work can get started. We then will have the construction, which is scheduled to start next year, 2020. And then we should, you know, be looking at, I think, probably a 1 to 2 year build out
Usually, yeah.
of the fire station, and then we're going to have that issue at least resolved with a new building that serves the needs of a modern fire station in the community, making sure it can provide good levels of service, but also commemorating the history of Halls Hill, which is truly fascinating.
Yeah, amazing. And we should mention that we were at the 100th anniversary
That's right.
of this fire station.
Wow.
And circle back to the issue of equity, right,
Yeah.
that we started on, and the stories that are given, and people who, you know, are still alive, who were like the first, I think, firemen to not work at that station because it was the black
Right.
station.
Yeah.
And it was originally built because white firemen wouldn't put out fires for black families. I mean, it was just, you know, and when you hear these stories, it's just like, oh my, it sounds unreal. And then you meet somebody who lived through those times. It's really an important, I mean, it's just really important for our community.
So it's really a milestone kind of in our history.
It is.
It
It's
is.
a
seeing
tremendous
the new.
milestone, yeah.
All right, well, we'll look forward to seeing that construction begin. There was another really interesting vote at this meeting, and this is for a specimen tree designation on private property.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about this and how this all came about.
You know, we have a tree preservation
Christian,
ordinance,
yeah.
and one of the things that we allow are for there to be designations of trees as specimens, and those are noted for their size and the crown spread. Basically, they stand as exemplars of you know, the species at its best at its best growth. And we have about 25 of them in the county. 17 are on private property. And what has to happen is a private property owner designates their tree as a specimen if it meets the criteria, and then it means that that tree will have to be protected and preserved regardless of who owns the property.
I was just going to say, does
Yeah.
that change with the property owner? Should that?
Yeah.
It's
So
big,
it's
and
recorded
that's a
on the.
big deal.
It is. It's recorded on the land records, and
Yeah.
you know there are limited circumstances in which the tree could be removed, but they're quite limited. And the whole idea is that someone who has a property with one of these specimen trees believes so strongly about it that they're willing to essentially encumber their property rights, not only while they have it, but as it changes in perpetuity.
What I think we're finding is how much people have a personal connection with a big tree. And it's really interesting. I think it's a very positive thing, but we've had, too many big, beautiful trees that get taken down because somebody was going to build a bigger house. And more you're hearing all of the neighbors and how many people are upset about this tree. It's almost like it's a living being. So this is a small step that we're taking to try and protect those trees, but it's part of that whole change that we've been talking about and trying to preserve things and balance it. And
Balance the growth,
yeah, and it's a challenge every day.
And I'm sure people in our community would love for us to go ahead and designate specimens on our own and
But we
create
can't
that
do
level
that.
of protection, but we can't do
Right.
that.
It is on private property,
That's
so
right.
it's on the homeowner
That's
to
right.
make that decision.
That's right. So we encourage all homeowners who have such a specimen to go that route, but we realize it's not right for everyone.
Of course. All right. Well, on that note, it's going to bring us to the end of another edition of County Board Wrap-Up. Thank you for joining us once again as we take a look at the decisions and what we're going to be looking forward to throughout the course of 2019. And thank you for joining us. Remember, all County Board meetings are open to the public. They're live streamed and archived on our website, which is arlingtonva.us, and just search County Board. And if you want to tell us what you think about these and other issues, just visit the county website at topics.arlingtonva.us/engage. I'm Kara O'Donnell, and we'll see you again next month for another County Board Wrap-Up.